Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Erwin Jackson, and I'm the Director of Policy at the Investor Group on Climate Change. And I'm going to be facilitating the session this afternoon entitled The Undiscovered Country, Jobs and Investment in a Clean, Green, Post-COVID Australia. Before I start, however, I'd like to begin by our gathering here today by acknowledging the First Nations of the land in which I come from you today. I'm currently on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional owners and custodians of this land, and I recognise their continued connection to the land, water and culture. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd certainly invite you to acknowledge country if you're also paying respects in the chat. I know that the various speakers will also have some words as we go into that as well. We have today three excellent speakers. First up is Michael Lord, who's a lead researcher Beyond Zero Emissions, who's going to talk us through the 1 million jobs plan. Then we have Janelle Burston, who's the carbon and energy manager at Wesfarmers, and Akaash Sachdeva, senior responsible investment manager at HESTA. So we're going to kick off today with Michael, and then go to Janine, and then to Akaash, and then I'll kick off the panel with a few questions, and then we'll open it up and hopefully get a bit of an engaging session at the end. So Michael, why don't I kick over to you?
Thanks, Erwin. So as Erwin said, I'm Michael Lord. I'm the head of research at Beyond Zero Emissions. I'm talking from 𝗰𝗶𝗶𝗁 country, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. So Beyond Zero Emissions, a lot of you will know, is a climate and energy think tank. We've been showing for more than 10 years that eliminating greenhouse gas emissions is technically possible. So I guess we focused on things like, our first plan was we issued the first plan for 100% renewable energy system for Australia. So it was showing about how is that possible? How can we balance the grid? Or in a domestic setting, how is it possible to stop burning gas for heating and cooking and heating hot water? So technical things, an engineering and a political focus. But increasingly, Beyond Zero Emissions has also spoken about not just that it's technically possible to eliminate emissions, but it's going to be great. It's going to be great for Australia. There's a huge opportunity here. We can have lower energy bills. We can have more comfortable homes. And economically, it can be great. So the first report of ours that focused really on this economic aspect was the Renewable Energy Superpower Report in 2015. I think quite a few people, including politicians, now use that term, renewable energy superpower. I believe it originated from our report. This really it put us in a very good position to respond to the situation Australia was in and the world was in at the start of this year when the pandemic hit. So the pandemic caused, amongst other things, an economic crisis and a huge upsurge in unemployment, and we haven't seen the end of that yet. A lot of employment is being maintained by JobKeeper. And so we've got this need to stimulate the economy, to create jobs. Governments are showing willingness to spend hundreds of billions to stimulate the economy. And this is the type of action we've been saying is needed on climate change, the type of strong action for many decades. And so we can actually dig ourselves out of this current crisis, this hopefully short-term crisis, at the same time as responding to the larger long-term crisis of climate change. And our Million Jobs Plan, which we launched at the end of June, is a call for Australian governments and Australian businesses to do that and to recognise the huge potential, economic potential and potential in employment in transitioning to zero carbon emissions, in making this a national mission for us to decarbonize as quickly as possible. And there's work to be done, and that's a good thing because it employs people and creates new industries. So when we developed the Million Jobs Plan, our chief sort of principle for the plan was the ideas in it had to create jobs and reduce emissions. We also emphasized that the jobs had to be created quickly. You know, people are unemployed now, not in 10 years' time. So we needed things that were either shovel ready or could become shovel ready quickly. And we were also looking for, yes, government action, but only modest government expenditure. So we really were looking to leverage hundreds of billions in private sector finance. And we had some independent economic analysis done of the Million Jobs Plan, which confirmed many of the findings, that it would increase GDP, it would increase productivity, and it would increase employment for a modest government outlay. So the Million Jobs Plan kind of does what it says. It sets out the opportunities for more than 1 million jobs in all the sectors that produce greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a chapter on renewable energy, one on buildings, manufacturing, recycling, transport, and also land use. So there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs in all of these areas. And many of those jobs are based on renewable energy. So most of the actual jobs are not in the renewable energy industry, but renewable energy underpins the jobs in manufacturing and transport, for example. And that's because to decarbonize, we need to, just to put it crudely, this is almost true, we need to electrify everything. We need to electrify industry, we need to electrify transport, we need to electrify buildings. And now we have the technology to do that at an affordable cost, which is cheap solar and wind backed up by storage and dispatchable generation. So in the plan, the scale of renewable energy we were talking about was 90 gigawatts to be built in the next 5 years, backed by 20 gigawatts of storage. That's a huge increase on the amount of renewable energy we've been building recently, to be honest, in any country. But it's not unrealistic. It's actually less than the renewable energy developments that are in the pipeline, that are at some stage of development already in Australia. There is hundreds of billions of private sector investment queuing up to invest in renewable energy. And if we get the public policy settings right, we can leverage a lot of that investment. And the 90 gigawatts we're talking about is just the start of Australia's potential to generate and use renewable electricity. We could be generating with renewables 5, 6, 7 times what we do from all sources at the moment. And that's because of a really exceptional position that Australia is in, being a very large country with plentiful solar and wind resources and a low population density. If I think about where I'm from, the UK, you can't really talk about a 500% renewable energy target for the UK. It doesn't make any sense at the moment. It's not, there just isn't enough land and there aren't enough resources. But you can talk about that scale of ambition for Australia. And that's what's really exciting. And we think that that's going to be a key source of Australia's comparative advantage, this low cost, abundant renewable energy in the future. So about 1 in 10 of the jobs in the plan were based in renewable energy. But as I say, that underpinned jobs in other sectors. So a larger number of jobs were in manufacturing. So as I say, the low-cost renewable energy can be part of Australia's comparative advantage in manufacturing. Australia can produce energy-intensive export goods such as metals and hydrogen-based chemicals like ammonia and methanol using this renewable energy. And there are tens of thousands of jobs in these new industries. We already mine, just focusing on metals. Australia is already one of the world's really big miners of metals, and metals are crucial to the whole zero carbon transition because they're so important to solar panels and wind turbines and batteries, etc. So Australia could be not just mining those metals, but manufacturing them a lot more. So processing iron ore into steel, processing copper, manganese, nickel, a whole lithium, a whole host of metals using renewable energy. And these would be low carbon metals produced at a competitive price, but with a very willing global market, which is increasingly interested in lower emissions products. Another of our big areas for job creation is in buildings, particularly retrofits. Most Australians, and I include myself in this, are wasting money every year living in inefficient homes. This is a huge business opportunity, but there are a few hurdles to get over in these, to realize this business opportunity. But it's going to take tens of thousands of people to do the home energy retrofits that we need to make our homes much cheaper to run and more comfortable to live in. We also had chapters, which I won't go into, but on transport, recycling and land restoration, areas that can produce more hundreds of thousands of jobs. And if you go to our website, millionjobsplan.com.au, you can see the report and see how we generate all of these jobs. So in summary, the Million Jobs Plan is, I think, of a compelling call to arms and a argument for why we need to really stop at all levels, government, business, stop thinking about climate action as related to sacrifice and self-denial. Climate action for Australia is a huge business opportunity. It's a huge opportunity to stimulate new industries, to lower power prices, to inhabit more comfortable buildings, and yes, to create 1 million jobs. So yeah, Lisa's posted the link in the chat. Please have a look at the plan, and yeah, happy to answer any questions in the question and answer session. Thanks, Erwin.
Thank you, Michael. Very exciting plan, and great to hear all about it. So I'm now going to pass over to Janelle from Wesfarmers to give a bit of an insight into how corporate Australia is thinking about some of these issues.
Thanks, Erwin. I'd like to first start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I am here in Perth. That's the 𝗰𝗀𝗃 people of the Noongar Nation, and extend my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd also like to extend that to any members of the First Nation who are on the call with us today. So from a corporate standpoint, I think the case for business action now, it's getting closer and closer to essentially being the cost of inaction will be far greater than the cost of action. And you can see that already in the way capital is moving around the world. Capital prefers greener investments. So we're seeing more and more investment vehicles that are aligned to more environmental or climate conscious businesses. And there's been a lot of studies done that prove that businesses that have a more sustainable focus actually provide higher returns in the long term. That's definitely something that, from a Wesfarmers standpoint, we are always looking at. Our purpose is to provide satisfactory returns over the long term, and we always frame that around ensuring that we are taking into account the communities that we engage with, the environment, our suppliers, our customers, our employees. All of those things are incredibly important, and that's really all about taking that long-term view, and that is what most capital funds do. I'm sure Akaash will talk to this more when he speaks to us. But that's definitely sort of a lot of how we frame the beginning of the sort of business case. I think you sort of need to build your business case in layers, and depending on who the stakeholders are, those layers are more or less important. But from a large corporate standpoint, capital is obviously a important part of our business. The other side of that is debt. So you can actually achieve a discount on your cost of debt via agreeing to emissions reduction targets or other social or environmental metrics. So Wesfarmers has entered into what's known as a sustainability linked loan with the Commonwealth Bank. And under that, we have targets around reducing our emissions and increasing our Indigenous employment. And meeting those targets means that we actually obtain a discount on the cost of our debt. So that is straight to the bottom line. That means we pay less out to the bank and we make more profit for the shareholders. So it's a win-win. Well, it's a win for us, definitely. On that funding side, the bond market, the green bond market is the fastest growing bond market in the world now, and that's estimated to hit $1 trillion by the beginning of next year. So for what used to be a niche area probably 4 to 5 years ago, that has moved ahead in leaps and bounds. The sort of next layer down in that business case is understanding where your quick wins are from an emissions reduction standpoint. This is probably a little bit more granular than the capital side of it, but quick wins and high returns and getting a few runs on the board means that next time you want to propose a project that is reducing emissions, you have that those runs on the board. So we tend to work to a hierarchy of emissions reduction, the first one being energy efficiency and energy productivity. So first, use less, then you have less that you need to generate afterwards. So Michael touched on the residential area, but from a commercial building standpoint, most of this technology has been economic, commercial and scalable for a number of years now. So things like LED lighting and insulation in walls and ceilings, building energy management systems, which are systems that can automatically shut down various parts of the store, air conditioning, lights, all those sorts of things are quite economical now. And there's also a number of government programs that you can tap into that assist you with that upfront capital cost as well. So if you have a low capital cost and you are using less energy as a result, again, it's just a lower cost to your business. So it's an easy sell, I suppose, in that regard. That sort of assists with the electricity side of it from a Scope 1 emissions, which is sort of our hard to abate side of the business. We ensure that we are always looking at technology that can assist in that area as well. We invest in an abatement catalyst at our nitric acid plants, and that lowers the emissions substantially, and that's technology that has been around for a couple of years now, but is getting more and more efficient. One of the ways that we help to build the business case for those sorts of technologies is by applying an internal carbon price. So the Australia doesn't currently have a wide-reaching carbon price. We do have legislation that via the Safeguard Mechanism and the Emissions Reduction Fund, which is now the Climate Solution Fund, does apply a cost of carbon to very high emitting industries, but it's been largely toothless, that legislation historically. That's changing now. There's amendments to baselines that remove that headwind area, or headway, I should say, for really emissions intensive businesses. But from a global standpoint, we are still laggards in that area. So to work around that, we apply an internal carbon price, and that means that we are ensuring we focus our investment dollar on lower carbon alternatives, regardless of what the policy environment requires us to do. And another simple way that we have found in our plants, actually, which has been very impactful, is employee surveys. So making the most of the knowledge of the people on the ground who work in our plants. And a question that was, if you could do one thing that would reduce emissions, what would you do? And there have been a number of waste heat and fugitive gas projects that have come out of that, which have allowed us to lower our emissions and actually also increase plant productivity. So they were easy wins. We just had to go out and ask the question, basically. And finally, it's about generating or procuring green. As Michael said, it is very economic now to install either solar panels on your roofs or procure green via a larger contractual arrangement with a solar farm or a wind farm. And that cost is dropping year on year. I think there are stats around over the last 4 years, solar panels have doubled in efficiency of generation and halved in price. So the economics around solar is well known, it's scalable, it's an easy solution for anyone who has a roof. You should really put some solar panels on it. And the final area, I suppose, around that is just investing in the future. So one of the projects that I've been quite heavily involved in is around the TCFDs, and that's been a very useful framework for large corporates. And one part of that is around understanding where your climate risks are. So once you've got that view on your climate risks, we then took those and flipped them on their head and look for opportunities. And that's just about thinking outside the box a little bit around how you could solve some of those risks or mitigate or adapt to some of those risks. And it helps to allow those opportunities to bubble to the surface. Part of that, or following on from that, is all of the various emerging markets and technologies that are out there. So the batteries, green ammonia, bioenergy, soil carbon projects, all of those sorts of markets and technologies are maturing, and they're maturing quite quickly from a comparison to history standpoint. And the size of that, the size of that opportunity is unknown, really. There's been many, many studies. I think I've seen figures from 1 trillion to, I don't know, 6 trillion or something like that. I sort of feel a little bit like once you're in the trillions, it's almost a moot point. Clearly, it's a very, very large opportunity. I think if you look at what ARENA's done, they've spent something around 1.6 billion, and those projects now are worth close to 6.5 billion. And that was from taking the lead, looking at projects that needed a little bit of help to get off the ground, and they've done amazing things, most of those projects. Looking at what others are doing across the globe and understanding where some of those opportunities are and how you could especially from a technology standpoint, whether you can bring any of those into your business, or looking at how other large corporates are, or other businesses in general, are solving the problem. If you can't bring it to your business, why not? What are the barriers? What's stopping that technology from being usable in your business, or that from what's stopping you from entering that market, or investing or purchasing, being part of that solution. And finally, I think one of the other, this is less about the business case, I suppose, but it's just more about the solution, is engaging far and wide. So everything from universities, who are the ones looking at how these technologies could work and constantly evolving and researching in this area. We try to engage within our supply chain so that we can assist other parts of our supply chain to decarbonise. And other stakeholders, our investor groups and non-government organisations that would like us to transition. So that, and the government, we're trying to collaborate with the government as well, to ensure that everyone's working towards the same goal. Everyone, well, there's often times where many people are working towards the same goal, but separately. If you can bring all those people together and as a group work towards that goal, then usually you get a better outcome, a faster outcome, and it's everyone's more engaged. It's a win-win situation for the group, the university, the corporate, the government, everyone. So I think that's my thoughts on Better Futures and the business case. I'll hand it back to you, Erwin.
Well, thank you very much for those insights. And given you mentioned investors on a number of occasions, I might throw to Akaash now to talk a bit about HESTA's approach to these issues.
Great. Thanks, Erwin. My name is Akaash. I'm from the Responsible Investment team at HESTA. We are the super fund for workers in the health and community sector. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, traditional custodians of the land on which I'm zooming in from today, and pay my respect to their elders, past and present. And I extend that respect to any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. In terms of thinking about the business case for action from the point of view of a super fund, it's good to start with how we think about climate change in general. And so super funds are long-term investors. We can hold assets for decades. We have members who are retiring today. We have members who are not going to retire well into the 2050s. And so we know we have to think about risks over long time frames. In that context, we know that climate change is a risk for long-term performance of our members' investments, and we know it'll have far-reaching impacts on the world they'll retire into. The other aspect is that large funds like HESTA are also what we call universal owners. And this means that we're invested so widely, we basically own a slice of the economy. So we're exposed to risks at the economy or the system-wide level. Climate change is a great example of a system-wide risk that we have to manage, because it's actually impossible for us to get away from climate change or climate risk by just divesting. Because even if we divested any fossil fuels in our portfolio, the emissions from those assets would still be in the system, and we would still be exposed because of our exposure across the system as a whole. And we would still be exposed to the physical risk of extreme weather events, which wouldn't just go away through divestment. So basically, thinking long-term and then also thinking at a system level is what gives HESTA our business case to support net zero emissions across our portfolio, but more importantly, across the economy at large, because it's that economy-wide action that's required to actually protect the financial future of our members. And I think what we're seeing at the moment, a bit of an inflection point in responsible investment, where global investors are becoming more active in managing these risks, in making these kind of commitments. And the recovery from COVID-19 is a really unique opportunity for a green-led approach that's consistent with Paris and really sets us up for the future. At HESTA, we see that our long-term focus, our scale, our expertise, and our long history in responsible investment, when we and funds like us are uniquely placed to support the transition to low carbon economy and support the economic recovery post-COVID as well. In terms of how we assess the opportunity, HESTA has spent the last 14 years investing in renewable energy, and we have considerable experience in that area. We've currently got over $300 million invested in renewable energy. And some research recently done by the AGCC shows that in an orderly transition to a net zero world, that would unlock around $63 billion in total investment to 2025, supporting the economic recovery from the current situation. And more broadly, the amount of investment in renewables and clean energy that's required from now to 2050 is somewhere close to $400 billion. And excuse me, HESTA want to play our part in investing in this clean tech opportunity in Australia. I think this is a really good opportunity to highlight that, as keen as we have been over a long period of time to get into the renewable space and take advantage of that space, we find that currently projects with the right risk return characteristics and long-term contractual certainty are relatively rare. And the reason for that is because of a lack of policy certainty. So a good stat is that for every dollar we have invested in Australian renewables, we actually have $3 committed in equivalent assets overseas. And this is basically because in countries with stable, predictable policy settings, this gives us the confidence to make long-term investments. A good example of a recent project in Australia is the Snowtown 2 wind farm. This is a really high quality renewable investment that we made in South Australia. And it came with a relatively long contracted period, which went beyond the renewable energy target period, and elements of protection from grid stability issues. And these are the sort of the features that give us the long-term certainty to go and invest members' money, knowing that we have long-term returns. And so this is our thinking behind why we've sort of, as well as engaging with companies, as well as investing in renewables ourselves, we're also advocating for long-term climate policy action in Australia. We're calling for a national target of net zero emissions, calling for government to remove barriers to long-term investment and enable more innovative investment partnerships and structures to boost investment in clean techs. Yeah, that's all for me. Thanks, Erwin.
Thanks, Akaash. So just, I'm going to start off with a few questions to the panel, and then we'll open it up more broadly. But the first thing I wanted to sort of ask everyone was, a few people mentioned inflection points and various drivers that are going on behind the scenes. But over the last 30 years or so, we've seen lots of, many campaigns have been focused on solutions on climate change. Why do you think we're getting more traction now in that space, and as opposed to the past? So I might just kick off with you, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Erwin. I think it's becoming increasingly obvious we are going through one of these transitions that we see in history from time to time. The transition from wind and water energy at the end of the 18th century towards steam, or transition from horse and cart to cars. We go from these systems which are dominant, and then there's a transition period, and then everyone forgets that we used to get around in horse and cart and thinks a car's normal and not that recent. I just think that there are so many things pointing now towards the fact that we really are at an inflection point. If I had to point to one thing, it would be the cost of solar and wind energy. So a lot of this transition is based on our ability to produce renewable energy at affordable costs. So I think about 80% of global emissions are energy related. Solar and wind have been coming down in price for a long time, but now it's just undeniable that these are the cheapest ways of new energy generation. And even the International Energy Agency, which has taken a long time coming to the party, has recently said solar is king. So this underpins everything that Janelle has spoken about and Akaash has spoken about, the private sector and investment appetite to set renewable energy targets, carbon reduction targets, is underpinned by this, the fact that the lowest cost form of generating electricity is now also renewable. And I'll just mention one other thing that I think is contributing to this is government's response around the world to COVID-19, which has been really huge government investment in stimulus. And some of this has been directed towards green stimulus. But I think this sounds the beginning of the end for an era where we say that governments can't lead on transition, and we just have to sit back and let the markets do everything. The governments have shown a willingness to intervene in a crisis, and I think and hope that this will continue in terms of the climate crisis, and the new fashion for government intervention spending will continue.
Thanks, Michael. Janelle?
Yeah, I'd echo that. I think a lot of it is down to the commercial reality. generating green is cheaper now, and most of the technology around energy efficiency is commercial as well. I also think from a community standpoint, at the beginning of this year, we had horrific bushfires across the country. And I think it really brought home to a lot of people that this is what the future could look like. We're living it now. All of whether or not you think that comes from climate change or not, that is one of the increased risk factors that could potentially happen under a warmed planet scenario. So I think people saw that and felt that and saw the devastation that it caused, and that was also a bit of a catalyst for change. Simultaneously, the Davos climate talks were happening, and so the Australian bushfires were elevated to a global discussion as a result of that. And I think that has also helped to drive that agenda. And then we're in COVID, and there is some research that suggests that it's the fact that we are degrading the environment so quickly, and that there is so much biodiversity loss, and that we're encroaching on all of the natural systems, that the potential for zoonotic disease transfer in the future could increase. So I think the understanding across the community has increased substantially in the last 12 months around just how important this is, and if we don't move quickly, what we are facing as a potential future for our children is scary, right? So I think the community is more aware, and that helps to drive action, because we have people who will move their money from one super fund to another if the super fund isn't investing in the right businesses, or they will sign up to various other investor groups that are actively engaging with large corporates around what your decarbonisation strategies are. So I think that has also played a part.
So I actually want to come back to this question about investor and company engagement in a sec, but Akaash, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really great summary of some of the recent reasons for why action is taking place. Probably, you know, from a community point of view, the bushfires at the start of this year, as long ago as that seems, probably, you know, really changed, I think, just the mood of the people you could see was different. I think from a commercial or technical point of view, the cost equation is completely different. I think the big thing from the financial sector's point of view is the task force for climate-related financial disclosure, and, you know, the recognition from you know, the Financial Stability Board and Mark Carney about 5 years ago that climate change is a financial risk. Once that penny dropped, and then you see it through to, you know, a few years ago, then the emphasis on investors and also on companies was about, well, all right, now we think it's a risk. Tell us about this risk, disclose on the risk, show us scenario analysis. And a lot of focus has been on, at that stage, was on, you know, assessing the risk. Whereas now that the risk has been assessed and people understand what it is, I think we're now moving to that next stage of going, all right, just more disclosure is not enough. We actually have to see action. And that kind of natural progression is taking place from thinking to doing.
Thanks, Akaash. So on this question of company engagement then, like Akaash, I know you are involved in Climate Action 100+, which is a sort of an initiative which has about half of global assets under management, looking at engaging with companies to ensure that they're putting in place strategies to achieve net zero emissions and have Paris-aligned decision-making, etc.
Yeah.
Part of that is obviously lots of engagement between companies, investors. Can you give us some examples of where you've seen that work?
Yeah, sure.
And also, I'd be really interested also in Janelle's reflections on this, given that this is there's, you know, you've got the owners on one side and you've got the company on the other side. And where does collaboration work, and how has it been helping and working within your company to actually drive innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take a step back and answer some of the questions in the chat as well on this topic. So, really, as I said before, climate change being a system-wide risk, you can't divest it away. And so really for us, the emphasis of our approach is on active ownership and engagement with companies. We also know that, is part of our fiduciary duty to our members, we have to sort of think about things other than climate change, frankly. And so it's an important element in how we think long term. But in the overall picture, we know when you've got, large global companies, divestment is not the easy answer. Sorry, it is an easy answer, but it's an ideologically pure answer, but it's not really the answer that's going to give us the outcomes that we need. So as Erwin mentioned, Climate Action 100+ is a collaborative initiative of investors around the world. The value of something like that is, when we go to the board of like a Wesfarmers, investors going together, we can say, well, we own 20, 30, 40% of your register, and we're here providing a single message about what's important. The focus of Climate Action 100+ has been on getting companies to disclose according to TCFD, to talk about their risks, to talk about scenario analysis, and then going that step further now, where the current emphasis is on setting targets, so getting companies in the economy to set net zero targets, and then to set short and medium term targets aligned to those, and then going that extra step and going, well, align executive REM to those targets, for instance. And I think this is really, really valuable, because by actually getting the companies we invest in and creating those long-term partnerships and collaborations to actually get those companies to set targets, it actually moves the entire economy. And so by doing this, we're safeguarding our own portfolios, but getting that whole of system economy-wide change that we actually need. I think the stat I've seen is that in 2019, maybe close to 80% of companies in the ASX hadn't set emissions targets. And I think now with Climate Action 100, what we are seeing is progress in companies being able to set targets, but also the most value that it's created is by having all investors on a single page asking the same ask of companies. It creates really open dialogues, and it's created a lot of progress that otherwise wouldn't have happened.
Janelle?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think I wholeheartedly agree the TCFD has been a great addition to an annual report. Reframing climate risk and environmental risk as a financial risk means that it is focused on by the business across the board, as opposed to just sections of the business. So I think that side of it and going through those was really quite an educational process to go through those scenarios and deep dive into the business risks and opportunities in that way. And it's, as Akaash has said, it's helped to open up the dialogue between various investors and the company itself. So through just sitting down, sounds so simple, but just sitting down in a room and having a conversation, or sitting down in a virtual room and having a conversation around what those risks are, how the company's thinking about mitigating them or adapting to them, depending on what the options are, it just builds that rapport and ensures that you can have those open dialogues and have that collaboration with your major investors and various other stakeholders and across the business on an ongoing basis. So if there is a concern, it's not a surprise often what the investors are concerned about. We're already thinking about and have been for a while. It's just, I guess there's a slight mismatch between what's happening and being thought about in the company and what goes out in an annual report. So I guess it's just opening up that dialogue, ensuring that it's a collaborative process around how we deal with large systemic risks that, it's going to affect the whole economy if we don't get it right. So it's it's just about open communication, I think, and that definitely helps.
Thanks, Janelle. One of the things that's been also a theme across everything that all the panelists talked about was the role of government. And it's sort of always the elephant in the room in Australia when you have these kinds of conversations. But I think, like, we all know that the government needs to do more to support the transition. I think the question I'd like to ask is, from your respective points of view, what are the areas that you're finding useful in terms of your engagement with government? What emphasis or how are you approaching your engagement with the government where you're finding it either helps or it doesn't help, but you think is useful in terms of starting that engagement and actually bringing government back to the table, the federal government back to the table? So I might just throw to you, Michael, first.
Yeah, thanks, Erwin. This year, and certainly since we launched the Million Jobs Plan, a lot of our advocacy focus, because Beyond Zero Emissions produces these reports, but then we put some effort into communicating and advocating for them. A lot of our focus has been on the federal government, who we know are not as progressive as many companies and other governments on climate action. So I think the things that have helped are not talking about fossil fuels or climate change. So we don't raise those issues at all. What we focus on is the economic possibilities of renewable energy, why this is going to be good for the economy, and why it is going to be something you can sell to that part of the electorate that isn't motivated by action on climate change. So yeah, we talk about jobs, we talk about export revenues, and we talk about positive things. We don't try and apply pressure. Other elements of the climate movement are very good at that, but our specific role is to talk things up. And the type of things we're looking at is, as Akaash mentioned, we need policy certainty. If you contrast Australia to the European Union, there can't be a company in the European Union that looks at the current or future political landscape and thinks that things are going in any other direction but pretty rapid decarbonisation. The only thing they might wonder is how rapid. But all the policy settings, the sticks and the carrots are pointing in that direction, which isn't quite the same here when, until recently, the government was talking about building a coal-fired power station and is still talking about building gas-fired power stations. So we need long-term targets from federal government, and we need short-term targets, and we need federal government perhaps to intervene in some of the areas of that are blocking the transition. So one of those things is transmission, electricity transmission infrastructure, or the lack of it is somewhat of a barrier to rapid rollout of renewable energy. Another might be electric car charging infrastructure. These are the type of specific areas where the government could help. But we need governments at all levels to recognise that this is an opportunity and set all policies accordingly.
Thanks, Michael. And just to note, like the report that Akaash mentioned that we did a little while ago actually also identified those areas that you mentioned: transmission, distribution, electrification, infrastructure, transport, those kinds of things, along with the land sector, were one of the big investment opportunities that we saw in the short term. And in
great.
So, Janelle.
I would echo those. We try to engage positively with the government. From a corporate standpoint, the background issue is that we want to maintain our global competitiveness. So Australia not having a carbon price when the rest of the world is largely has one. I mean, Europe has one. There's most of the provinces in China have one. New Zealand has one. All of those countries, I should say, are moving ahead. So from an Australian standpoint, it erodes our competitiveness because the EU, for example, is now looking at what they call border tax adjustments, which means if you export to the EU, your goods will be levied with input tax, essentially, which means that that carbon cost is still applied to that good. It's just that the revenue is then received by a different country. So from a government standpoint, we try to talk about how it would be good to keep that revenue in Australia and then use that revenue on decarbonisation projects or other community support projects. The transition has the potential to adversely affect some people and really help others. So ensuring that it's a just transition for everyone is important, and the government could be generating revenue that they can then put towards a just transition for those who need retraining from one industry to the other and things like that. So my role specifically, I talk a lot about carbon pricing with the government and the regulator and where it's heading. I think from a opportunity standpoint, a lot of the states have great opportunities. Even local government probably has great opportunities around those the charging infrastructure. There are some interesting partnerships that are potential partnerships or partnerships. I think there's some in South Australia that look quite amazing around rolling out those charging opportunities at everywhere, train stations, hospitals, etc. So I think, as Michael said, ensuring that all levels of government can see some of those opportunities to assist that decarbonisation journey for the community is important. And I think we just continue to talk to the federal government around just ensuring that Australia is not a laggard in the global policy environment.
Thanks, Janelle.
Probably picking up on what others have mentioned, that the expression "investors want certainty" has been around for a long time. I think where we've got some headway, I know with government, has been explaining a little bit of what that means. And like I said, in renewables in particular, what we look for in a good renewables project is long-term contracts. And so when you've got long-term, renewable targets, it provided you with the ability to get long-term contracts. And so getting down into the technical has been really good in sort of been explaining to the regulators and government what that certainty looks like. I think the other aspect in terms of advocacy that let's be honest, investors have not always been great on, but which we're getting better at, is across the E, S, and G spectrum, if you like, is joining the dots of the E and the S sides of climate change. So, thinking about renewables and carbon pricing and physical risk on the E side, but also thinking about the economic and community transition on the S side, and starting to think about how we engage with policymakers and with local communities and with unions on that social transition that's required, especially in fossil fuel dependent communities. And I think that's something which is really, really valuable, because when you look at why has progress been so slow in Australia, it really has come down to the S side of things more than the E side. And the more we can integrate those two together, I think the more effective action will be.
Great point, Akaash. And one of the things that a few people mentioned there was sort of how we bring the sort of the macro, if you like, or the national down to the state and then the local level, where we're going to need all these different levels of action. From your particular standpoint, where do you see as the biggest opportunities for collaboration between sort of business investors, civil society with local council, and sort of bringing it down a level, if you like, local to local government? Michael?
Oh, sorry. I actually thought you were asking Akaash. Well, one of the areas where we'd like to see local government take action is with home energy retrofits. So one of the reasons why Beyond Zero Emissions argues that there's a huge economic potential in retrofitting people's houses. So homes become net zero energy producers, or at least produce as much renewable energy as they use over the course of the year, which is going to require houses to become more thermally efficient, to have more efficient appliances, and then use solar, and also to electrify, so to switch heating from gas to electricity. And one of the barriers to that as a business opportunity is, before businesses enter this market, they want to know that the demand is there. Someone needs to aggregate that demand. So that could be a role for local governments, and for local governments either on their own or in a small collaboration to set up pilot projects and to gather that demand locally and show that many thousands of houses can be retrofitted, and there's a business opportunity there. One other area is transport. So just in terms, for example, of low carbon or low energy transport, like walking and cycling, there's loads of things that local government could do. Cycling infrastructure is actually the best type of transport infrastructure in terms of bang for buck investment to jobs output. Most of the investment goes on labour rather than materials in cycling infrastructure, and is a low carbon method of transport. So yeah, building and home retrofits and cycling infrastructure are two areas where local governments could do a lot.
And Janelle?
Yeah, I would echo that. I hadn't really thought about it from a housing standpoint, but that seems like a great place for local governments to get involved, and providing surety to businesses that want to enter those markets is great. I think there's probably some opportunities around waste as well, which is sort of somewhat related to emissions, in that the waste industry is a very emissions intensive industry. So ensuring that we have electrified trucks that pick up recyclables that are well sorted and then recycled properly will stop that waste going to landfill and creating copious amounts of methane emissions. So I think local government actively promoting recycling, ensuring that the education piece around what goes into what bin and those sorts of things are sort of the grassroots opportunities that local government could focus on. Having targets around reducing the amount that's in your own red bin lid. For me, it's red bin. I assume everyone's the same. No, not personally, mine's a red bin. Yeah, I mean, I think the emissions from waste and the amount going to landfill is very problematic, and any kind of increase or assistance around recycling and that circular economy piece, ensuring that we can collect as much plastic, sort it, clean it, and then feed it back into processes that can reuse it, so that we aren't necessarily having to obtain virgin materials is a unique area that really local government is very well placed to actively engage in there.
Excellent, thank you. And now, Akaash, I know given the scale of the super funds, investments in local councils can be challenging, but I'm not sure that is well understood. But maybe you provide some insights into that, and
yeah,
maybe
sure.
articulate what you mean by an investable opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. That's my main thought in how to respond to this would be, for us, it's sort of, there's lots of opportunities out there, I think, at all levels for carbon reduction, carbon emissions to reduce. But for us, with the investor hat on, it's sort of, well, what's investable out of this? But I think one of the things that's really of interest to us, and we've seen this work in other fields, and this is part of the sort of policy submissions we've made, is around the use. It's around the use of sort of innovative investment partnerships and structures. And we've seen where this has worked, like in the medtech sort of field, where there are not things which are potentially at scale, like a wind farm or a solar farm is something which is a scale investment. It's big enough and it's expensive enough that we can see where it fits in an investment portfolio. But where emerging tech, it sort of more belongs with a venture capital investor than with a super fund. But I think maybe there is a place for policy and regulation around building the kind of innovative structures which can allow that early stage R&D type investment. And it's been proven in the medtech industry. We've got investments in that area that have done really well. And that's been very successful in being able to scale up from, here's an idea, here's something that we can get off the ground, and then build up to, institutional scale, which means big enough for us to invest in on an ongoing basis.
Thank you. Now I'm going to sort of open it up to some questions from the panel. And thank you all for the contributions so far. So one thing that came up early was we're seeing lots of commitments on emission reductions. But are we seeing why are we seeing those as opposed to just firm commitments to just transition to 100% renewable energy now? Is how I'm interpreting the question, which I think is right. So I might pass that to you, Janelle, given it's sort of focused on companies.
So I guess it probably depends a little on the emissions profile of the company. Within our business, our retailers, which are very much scope 2 emitters, so their emissions all come really from their electricity usage. They have all committed to renewable energy by 2025. The committing to net zero is about acknowledging that the scope 1 emissions in our businesses, so they're the emissions that are sort of direct to atmosphere or from the manufacturing of chemicals or fertilizers or ammonium nitrate. The technology around those isn't yet known. There is some technology to bring it down, but it's still a problem to be solved, essentially, from a tech standpoint. So I think it largely comes down to the emissions profile of the business. I can't speak to all the other companies out there, but I would have thought most retailers that are, or companies that are largely heavy electricity users would be more likely to commit to 100% renewable sourcing than necessarily net zero. Yeah, that's sort of the main background to it. Yeah.
Thank you. The other question that's come up comes back to government policy, and I don't think there's a right answer to this one, but could a large public campaign showing the benefits of carbon pricing help governments introduce one, focusing on pricing the externality, efficiency, and jobs and growth benefits that it would enable? I'm going to put Michael on the spot on that one.
Thanks, Erwin. Well, I mean, I think if you call it a carbon price or a carbon tax, it's been pretty effectively demonized. If you take it head on in that way in a public campaign, I don't know whether it would work or not. There are ways of introducing effectively a price on carbon, perhaps without calling it that. I think Janelle alluded to it slightly earlier. There is something called the safeguard mechanism, which if just ratcheted up, could actually introduce a carbon price on heavy emitters. But possibly the government could just about get away with saying, no, it's not a carbon price, it's just an extension of what we're already doing. So that's one way a carbon price could be implemented. I do think a carbon price is important, but it's not the be all and end all. I think we're beyond the point where we can just rely on a carbon price to affect the transition. I think we need to move more quickly than just a carbon price alone would allow. I do think it would allow things to happen more efficiently and smoothly and more cheaply, but it's not yeah, it's not the only game in town.
And I think I just might throw in on that as well, having been around all the carbon pricing campaigns in this country over the last few decades. Like I sort of agree with Michael that it's not going anywhere, and I actually don't think is actually what we really need. Like, and that's going to sound odd coming from an investor organisation because it is top of our policy priorities. I can't see a way in which it would evolve politically at the moment. But I think where the real opportunity is, in some respects, is on what's happened, for example, in New South Wales recently with their energy infrastructure plan that they've done. Now, like, there's going to be concerns raised about that particular policy because of the impact that it would have on the existing market. But at the end of the day, we do need to provide long-term clarity, and that currently is the only game in town. And then the question then becomes, how could that then be extended into other jurisdictions? So that you might, and that's it, because I think the narrative that really, and we've seen this, which goes to Akaash's point, that you're keeping the social and the economic and the environment all have to come together. Otherwise, we don't solve the problem. And carbon pricing just makes the social side, given the scare campaigns that would inevitably be run, very, very difficult, I think.
Erwin, can I just offer one observation on that as well? And I think it was raised on the panel previously, is in some ways we might sort of get one by default, just as major trading partners ramp up their commitments.
Yeah.
And, given how much of Australia's, economy, or the resources part of the economy, is export driven, I think, we pay a lot of attention to Canberra, but it's a big world out there. And I think as other people move, we're just going to get dragged along, to be honest. The other observation, coming back to something that Michael raised before, is that, carbon pricing, when, back in the heady days of the Garno sort of work, was sort of saying, all right, if we put the price on carbon, that means that, the cost of, say, coal or gas-fired generation, for simplicity's sake, would increase, and it would be comparable to sort of wind or solar, because wind and solar at that time was more expensive than fossil fuels. When you've got renewables which are cheaper than going and building new fossil fuels, you're already getting a price signal without a carbon price. And I think that's an important thing to note, in that, politically the ship might have sailed, but from an economic point of view as well, thinking has evolved.
Excellent. So we've had a lot of conversations here about opportunity, but someone in the panel in the chat has raised bringing up and discussing more the actual impacts of climate change. So I guess there's probably two questions associated with that. One is the sort of, if you guys have got any views about how that would work publicly, but also I think the other thing that might be useful to reflect on, because I know both Wesfarmers and you, HESTA, have done this work, is thinking about how assessment of the physical risks of climate change is impacted on your operations and your activities. So I might just go to Janelle.
So the physical risk standpoint, so from a planning and rolling out of new stores, things like that, the physical risk assessment has been very useful, because although we had considered things like floodplains and that sort of risk before, we hadn't looked at it quite as holistically as we had previously. So that physical risk around planning, literally from an in-country standpoint, has been very useful. When we look at our supply chains, the physical risks that are part of moving copious amounts of goods around the world is also something that I guess we had considered supply chain interruptions previously, but also COVID, I think, has actually helped to really bring home how easy it is for supply chains to be interrupted. And the overlay of COVID plus that physical risk assessment has meant that supply chain certainty and ensuring that we are globally diverse, as well as or just spreading that risk through our supply chain, has become a focus for a number of our businesses. Sorry, what was the other question?
Well, just the value of raising the campaigning, if you like, or advocating around climate change costs and damages? Like, if you don't have a view on it, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, there is the insurance industry is very good at understanding potential damage and impact. So, I mean, already we actually are seeing an increase in the cost of insurance across the insurance book. There are large international insurers who have exited Australia. They have taken a view that the risk of physical impacts within this country is such that they do not wish to insure any kind of commercial property here anymore. So, and that was a big move by a big, I think they're Swedish insurer. Just insurance is based on actuarial analysis, and they are very good actually at that. They're in the business of such things. So I think watching the insurance industry and what they are doing is a good sort of canary in the coal mine that, pardon the pun, given the topic, but that is where those potential damages are likely to fall, I think.
Thank you. Akaash, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, so the assessment of physical risks obviously has been part of our risk assessment that we've undertaken in the last couple of years. What we found is that a lot of it's sort of going, here are the physical risks, and then out of that you go, well, here's the impact, on the economy and society, and then out of that you go, okay, here's the potential impact that it could have on the fund itself. And once you go through all those levels, you kind of lose the signal. You lose the message of what the impact of droughts and floods and bushfires could be. But the other part of it is also because you're dealing with risks that are going to happen a long time, in some models, a long time in the future, or get worse in the future, even if they're already happening today, is you end up with sort of discount rates and assumptions being made in the modeling, which are not entirely satisfactory. We've looked at a lot of research on sort of, how to quantify potential physical risk from climate change. And the numbers just are too broad, or they're too vague to really make sense. And I'll come back to something I mentioned earlier, which was, this side of the year of 2020, you had the bushfires, and suddenly it becomes real. And it stops just being a number on the paper of this much GDP impact, which doesn't mean much to people. And you go, well, this is actually what happens. This is the chaos that it causes in people's lives. And actually, the way we're starting to think, and so HESTA's, we're the fund for the health and community sector. Healthcare workers are at the front line of some of those impacts, in supporting communities through something as traumatic as a bushfire. And so I think what we're trying to do is really understand the impact financially and quantifiably, but also qualitatively and socially. And really bring that perspective into how we think. And ultimately, the purpose of thinking about physical risks more than anything else has to be to create greater urgency to action. I think that's the most important part as well.
Thanks, Akaash. So I might just, we've probably got time for one more question from the group. And I think one that's come up has been around the role of TCFD, and everyone has touched on that recently in some way, shape or form, I think, in their presentations. So I'm wondering if you could expand a bit on how TCFD has helped you in terms of delivering the outcomes. And I know, Janelle, you've already touched on this to an extent, but I think the other thing I wouldn't mind your reflections on is that there is actually a global push at the moment for countries to implement mandatory TCFD, because it's currently under the Australian system. You could argue that it's mandatory, but there isn't clear guidance, for example, about what should be done really on TCFD from the financial regulators. So is there a case for mandatory TCFD in Australia? Would be the two parts of the question. Where does it really help, and is there a case for mandatory TCFD in Australia?
I can start on that one if you like. We found it really has helped. It's a great framework to to talk to people under. So using that framework, and we had a process where we went out and ran workshops with people from the MD level through to the person making the decision from a procurement standpoint on literally which boat that container should go on, and running through that process in a workshop sort of environment and talking through the different scenarios, helping people to visualize what each of those possible future sort of scenarios would look like was really quite a powerful tool. It opened up conversations, and it made people think about all of those risks in a different way. So from a bringing together people across different levels of the business, we've found it's been extraordinarily helpful. From a compliance standpoint, it is a weird one because technically, as you say, it's not a compliance piece, but it is referenced in ASIC guidance, the ASX listing rules, the corporations law, APRA. Everyone has come out and essentially said that you should report under it. And from a director standpoint, they would be in breach of their fiduciary duty if they didn't report under the TCFD if you're a listed company. So I kind of feel like it actually essentially is required in Australia. Really what's missing is just that final sentence from someone to say it, an extra clause in a law that says this is a requirement of every company or every listed entity or wherever you want to levy that compliance piece. Yeah, it's a weird one, but internally we essentially just view it as a compliance requirement. There is no way that we would not report under such a framework, and it's proven its worth already. So I think just from those two aspects, it's just part of the life going forward.
Can I actually bring Akaash here in, because I know, I think it's fair to say investors would like to see TCFD move from a compliance to a more strategic framework within companies, and we've just heard from a company which is probably one of the better in Australia in this front. So, but there obviously aren't. There are lots of companies who aren't doing as well as, say, Wesfarmers are. So from that point of view, Akaash, could you?
Yeah, sure. It's a really interesting one. I think that the key thing to TCFD was what led to its establishment, which, as I said, is framing climate change as a financial risk. And so for companies, it means, part of strategic and operational and day-to-day business decisions. And like Janelle mentioned, it's the MD and the procurement people, and not just the corporate social responsibility guys at the side. But it becomes, and a lot of the engagement with companies and the difference between what is a leading company and what are the guys who are still figuring out is there evidence that actually climate is built into strategy and operations. And good TCFD disclosure gives us an indication of that, but it's not the same thing. Like it's the disclosure framework, but actually what we want to see is this built into your strategy? And I think that the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and the ultimate thing that we want is targets. A lot of our focus to companies has been set targets in line with net zero, in line with Paris, and then prioritize your disclosure, because it's the target is the action, and then the disclosure is how you tell that story. That's bespoke to every company, but it's action that's required, not more disclosure for the sake of disclosure, which is sometimes something that happens.
It's almost say it's slightly circular though. Have those conversations to ensure that sorry, I'm on mute.
No, you're right.
To ensure that that people understand the importance of setting the target. Like, I don't know that we would have got to a target if we hadn't have gone through that education piece first, so that people understand how important it is that we set this target. Do you know what I mean? So But like I say, it's a great framework because it pulls together all of those 4 pillars, and yeah, it just builds it into your way of doing business, just a daily kind of consideration that people take into account. So
yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, I know it's a bit of a cliche to call, climate reporting a journey, but and for a lot of companies it is. You start off with dipping your toe in the water and get down to setting metrics and targets at the end. But I think it's important to, even at the start, to know that the ultimate outcome is to set targets.
Yeah, have the end game in mind.
Yeah.
Just to note that the UK's flagged that it's going to make reporting on TCFD compulsory, at least for pension funds.
Yeah, it's a global thing that's going to happen. I can't imagine a situation over the next 12 months where we don't get a plethora of countries committing to mandatory disclosures of TCFD, and not New Zealand committed to it. Yeah, it's just, I think it, and it really comes back from the point that, sorry. I completely lost train of thought there, and apologies for that, for someone inconveniently trying to call me.
It's going to become global.
All right. So I think we're have to wrap up now. So I think what I might do is just ask each individuals to sort of have any final reflections, and then I'll give some, and then do the administration at the end. So what if I start with you, Michael, given you started?
Oh, just I really think we are at an inflection point. I'm definitely not generally optimistic, I have to say, even though I work on climate change. I'm often quite pessimistic about what's happening. But this year, despite so much bad news this year, I do think there's been so much good news. Companies and investors and governments signaling that they are determined to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. We've spoken a lot about companies and investors, but also new countries added to that list of who have carbon neutral targets, like South Korea, Japan, China. I really think it is an exciting time, and we can only pray it just continues and snowballs in the years to come.
Great reflection, Michael. Thank you. Janelle?
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I do think that we are at a critical point in human history. We have the ability to make changes, and we have a lot of the technology available. We have some very intelligent people, some amazing brains that are turning their minds to how we solve for the solutions that we don't yet have. And I think this year has shown everyone that if you have to turn on a dime and really make changes quickly, we all do have the ability to do that. Inaction is just not an option anymore, and the cost of inaction will be far greater than the cost of action. So I think prioritizing changes, everything from little changes where you just turn off your computer every night, turn off your screens, turn off the light when you leave the room, little things, all the way through to multi-million-dollar investments in battery technology and those sorts of things. All of it has its place. There's no silver bullet solution, but I think the world now understands that working together to solve this is how we need to do it. And hopefully more and more countries, more and more governments, more and more corporates, investors, I think everyone is aligning, and hopefully that means we can progress this with a level of urgency.
Great. Akaash?
Yeah, thanks. I'd really just echo what Janelle and Michael have said. I think there's clearly a lot of momentum from global policy and technology and a lot of spheres, and an exciting moment. I'll just add just thanks to Better Futures Australia for the opportunity to speak today and to be part of this initiative, which I think is a great way to capture all the energy and the action that is starting to happen. And I've said before, I think now's the time that we're moving from words to action, and it's really great.
Well, that's a great segue, Akaash, and I hope you planned that perfectly for me. Now it's time for me to give the calls to action. form better futures. Just as a reminder, everyone. So just to encourage people to visit the Take Action on the website and sign the declaration. Spread the message, share your story on the website and tell other Australians about the actions that you're taking. Get involved in climate action and advocacy and register your upcoming sector for a discovery section, and play your part in the upcoming National Better Futures Forum, which is happening in July 2021, which will obviously be in the middle of a critical year as we head into COP26 in Glasgow in November. So I'm going to take the liberty of thanking our panelists for everyone. Really enjoyed the conversation. Glad to hear your perspectives, and really encouraging to hear it all ending on a positive note, because I actually feel the same way. Like, having worked on this issue for a very, very long time, it's sometimes easy to lose perspective because you're focused on the day-to-day and you're seeing the short-term incremental changes without recognizing that, 10 years ago, no one would have imagined China would have committed to net zero emissions by 2020. No one would have imagined it. And now they have, much quicker than anyone thought they would. So that's a good way to end. And I'll thank the panel again, and thank Better Futures Australia for organising.
Thank you.